Hi, Dr. Ruby Payne, Chapter 4, Emotional Poverty, Book 2. The Hippocampus. The stories we tell about ourselves, who we are. The research is that individuals will not do any activity that interferes or negates the story they have of themselves. And so what we know is when you do that, like for example in war, it often leads to PTSD. How do you keep a coherent story of who you are over time, past, present, future, and over context, work, school, at home, etc.? A coherent story is important. And COVID has really disrupted individual stories. So how do you know what stories a student carries in their head? And there is a technique called metaphor story, which I'll explain. But as you start looking at stories, one of the things that becomes important to understand that stories, all stories, have wounds in them. And there's a woman named McLean who's done a lot of hard research on stories. And she said the thing to remember is that stories are narratives that are constructed not by ourselves, that we have other people who help construct them. Our culture, intergenerationally, the stories that are passed on to us from other generations. Our parents and their stories help to co-author us. And one of the things that we know is that in all stories, there's wounds. If you allow a wound to define you, then you will stagnate and grow bitter. If you allow a wound to become a part of you, in other words, it's like a scar, then you can stay alive and moving and learning. And one of the key questions is, when a story has a wound in it, how do you then begin to heal that? Well, part of what McLean talks about is your ability to take a good or a story that's not so good and see the benefit in the story. What was the gift in that experience? And for example, at a very innocuous level, you didn't get elected class president your senior year of high school, perhaps. And you have to say to yourself, what was the gift in that? What was the benefit? Well, I learned how to run a campaign. I learned a lot of variables I didn't know. If I do this again, I'll be much better prepared. That would be seeing something good in the story. And so as stories unfold, as wounds unfold, and you begin to look at the stories students carry with you, the question is, how do you know what they are? I love the tool of metaphor story. Metaphor story comes out of narrative therapy, and there's two ways to do it. One is when you ask a series of cause and effect questions. And the important thing to know about metaphor stories is this. You always end on a positive note, and you don't use proper names. If you do it with a student, don't use their name, because then it gets hung up in the conscious, and you don't want that to happen. You want it to go under the conscious into the subconscious and think about the stories. Most people are not openly conscious about the fact that they have a story of themselves in their head. So let me illustrate briefly both kinds of stories. You have a story in your book, but one of the techniques, I had a mother come to me, and she said to me, Ruby, you've got to do something about Jennifer. Now, Jennifer was her 4th grade daughter. She said she keeps going to the nurse's office, and she said, I have to keep coming to get her. And she said she's going 2 to 3 days a week. And she said, Ruby, I just can't keep coming up here. I said, have you talked to her? She said, yes, I even took her to the doctor. I cannot find out what the problem is. So I called Jennifer in and I said, Jennifer, will you help me tell a story? She said, is this story about me? I said, it can be if you want it to be, but I'm not in the 4th grade. There's a lot I don't understand. I said, okay. Said once upon a time there was this girl, and she was a wonderful girl. She got along great in school, except she often went to the nurse's office. Why did she go? Now, she said, well, because she didn't know if she was sick or not. Now, that's a weird answer. And let me just say a couple things about metaphor stories. Educators like to ask motivational questions. Why? But you get further if you do what law enforcement does, and you ask procedural questions. So I said to her, so what happens to the girl when she goes to the nurse's office? See, I'd already asked my why question. She said, well, she doesn't know if she's sick or not. So I asked, what happens to the girl when she goes to the nurse's office? Because you're asking cause and effect. Do you think maybe something happened? She said, well, she takes her temperature. She does this. She does that. I said, did she find anything wrong? The girl said, no. I said, what did the girl do? She called her mother and had her come get her. I said, why? She said, because she didn't know if she's sick or not. Now, that's a weird answer. I should have picked up on it, but I was busy thinking about cause and effect. So I said, well, when the girl came back to the school the next day, did she go to the nurse's office? I was trying to figure out if there's a pattern. She said, no. I said, why not? She said, well, she didn't think about it. Well, by this time, I thought I lost my mind. I said, well, when the girl did go back to the nurse's office, why did she go? Because she didn't know if she was sick or not. I said, why didn't the girl know whether she was sick or not? Well, she launched in a big, long story. The girl, about 3 months earlier, had watched a television show. The girl on the television show had been her identical age, weight, height, looked like her. And the girl had died unexpectedly because she didn't know she was sick. So what you do is you build a solution in the story. So I said, so what the girl needs to do, mother needs to take her to the doctor, and this was an affluent family, so it wasn't a problem. So I said, and the doctor needs to give the girl a bunch of tests, and then the doctor needs to go over the tests with the girl, and if there's not a problem, the girl doesn't have to keep going to the nurse's office. So they did that. There wasn't a problem. She quit going. Well, I was telling this to a group of counselors, and one called me back and said, Ruby, it's wonderful, it works. I said, well, what happened? She said, well, I had this little first grade boy, all first semester. He went to the nurse's office virtually every day right after lunch, okay? And so they couldn't figure out what was the problem. They didn't know if he had colitis, if he had ulcers, etc. So she called the little boy in. She said, will you help me tell a story? And first graders almost always help. She said, they don't ask if it's about them. She said, so once upon a time there was a wonderful boy. The boy got along great in school, except that he often went to the nurse's office right after lunch every day. Why did the boy go to the nurse's office? And he looked at her and he said, because that's when he had math. Now, what you have are two students with the same behavior, two very different reasons, okay? And so occasionally you'll get stuck in a story. You'll ask every question you can and you can't find out. So then I used to say to students, wasn't that a lovely story? Now, there is another kind of metaphor story too, okay? And it's when you just tell a story. And if you go in your book, because stories are held in the subconscious and they direct behavior even when the conscious doesn't know it, okay? And one of the things is that in your book on page 100, there's a story. And on page 100, I give you a lot of sources for metaphor stories and stories you can read to students. But I love this one because it's a story you can tell to a student, okay, when there's addiction, depression, habit, motivation, neglect, where they have an attitude of resignation. There's just nothing I can do about it. It is who I am. And this is a story you can tell them. And it's very interesting how it lays in the subconscious and changes thinking. I mean, one of the things the Bible is known for is all of its parables. And the parables are basically metaphor stories. The prodigal son, etc. They're stories. And so it's called the Cart, the Mud, and I. And I'm just going to read it to you. And then you can look at other examples of metaphor stories in the book. When I forgot, so you're dealing with a student, you can't get anything from them, they're resigned, etc. And you say, oh, I got a story to tell you. The cart, the mud, and I. When I forgot to steer the cart around the mud, I said to myself, it's too late to do anything now. And I waited to see what would happen. When I pushed the cart right in the mud, I said to myself, it's too late to do anything now. I waited to see what would happen. When the cart sank in the mud, and I sank along with it, I said to myself, it's too late to do anything now. And I waited to see what would happen. When the cart disappeared in the mud, and I disappeared along with it. I knew what I had always known. And then you wait a little bit and you say, and as the cart and I were sinking, I remembered a movie in which a person had a cart sinking in the mud. As the mud got to my throat, I threw up my arm and yelled for help. A person walking down the road threw me a rope, and when I caught and struggled and allowed the person with the rope to slowly pull me out, I said to myself, it's never too late to do something. And then you can debrief the story this way. You know, most of us don't change until we have to. And we wait for a crisis till it happens. In other words, what you are doing with a metaphor story is you are indeed doing three things. To be successful, the story has to represent the problem in some form, identify a process to use, and then end with the situation resolved. Enjoy chapter 4.